Terry, could you tell me about your background and your family's political history?
I was born in Newbridge. I'm a member of, there's 6 in the family. My father was a councillor, chairman of Kildare County Council, a member of Fine Gael, and he died very young. And after that, Fine Gael approached my mother Nancy, and she then stood for election and became a councillor. And my first memory of politics, although at the time I didn't know it was politics, I was coming home from national school and there was a big long queue outside the door. And I thought, oh dear, what's happening? And when I went into the house, I saw my mother sitting at the table, talking to somebody. Now, the councillors in those days had huge say as to who got houses. And the council were giving out houses at the time. And that's why the queue was outside the door, because people knew that Nancy was good. And if she was good at councillor, and if she recommended them, the chances were that they would get a house. My second memory was in my teenage years when Nancy was a councillor and there was a big field up for sale. Or not up for sale, but up to be planned for industrial use. And the brown envelopes were circulating. And unfortunately, the landowner approached Nancy with a brown envelope, and she was horrified. She went to Fine Gael and explained the situation, and they told her to stay quiet. She went to the media, and as a result got thrown out of Fine Gael. She then stood for election as an independent and topped the poll in Newbridge.
And was this in the 1960s, was it?
This was in the 60s.
Oh, right.
So those things were happening even then.
Yeah.
So that was a terrible time in the house, because Nancy used to get phone calls at 3 o'clock in the morning warning her not to say anything about the brown envelopes. And as a widow woman on her own with 6 children, that wasn't easy thing to do, but she did it. She was a warrior. She also formed one of the first women's groups in the country, in Newbridge, in the 60s. So she was very much ahead of her time. So my life growing up was very much involved with politics, even though I may not have known the meaning of the word politics at the time. I was conscious of people, you know, that type of politics anyway.
And how did you become interested in the ideas of Marx? Was it when you were in college in Scotland?
Yeah. I started college in 1971 to study social work in Edinburgh. And one of my favourite subjects was sociology. And the lecturer was an amazing man. He was a brown man from South Africa who lived in exile because of his political affiliations. And he introduced me to Karl Marx, and I was fascinated at the thought of there was another system under which we could live under. And that's where I became very interested in that type of politics. I also had my first demonstration in Edinburgh when the then Minister for Education, Margaret Thatcher, was taking the milk from the school children. And there was thousands on this march, and to hear thousands of people chant Maggie Thatcher, the milk snatcher, was just amazing for me, coming from Newbridge. You know, never experienced anything like it in my life. Another thing happened while I was in college was I used to try and get home as often as I could. And I was hitching back to Scotland. I used to get the boat from Belfast, and this man was giving me a lift, and the news came on the radio. Internment was being brought out on that day, and the man started to freak out. And of course I didn't even know the meaning of the word internment. So I had to kind of ask him questions, and so he explained everything to me, what it meant. So I said to him, ignore me now and you go straight home. So we landed anyway in his home, and all hell was breaking loose on the street. My big memory for some reason is flour. Flour all over the place. It must have been what was to hand that people were throwing at the British soldiers.
In Belfast?
This was in Belfast. I'm after spilling water.
Not to worry.
This was in Belfast. I'm nervous. This was in Belfast. So the riot was going on. We went into the house. Full, I think there was about 13 children in the house, and the poor mother was running around the place packing. They were moving. And I'm standing there like a zombie wondering, what am I doing here? How am I going to get to all of these thoughts?
To the ferry.
Pardon?
How are you going to get to the ferry?
Yeah. So eventually a thought struck me. They didn't know where they were going. So I said, okay. I said to the man, if you can get me to the ferry, I will ring home and I will ask Mammy to put you up. So I got to the ferry, got on the ferry, demanded to see the captain. The captain came to me. I said, I want to make a phone call. So he got me a phone and got me to a phone, rang home, and they landed on Nancy's doorstep that evening. And they stayed in Newbridge for about 2 years after that. Mm. That was my first indication that something was going terribly wrong in my lovely country. Because you have to understand that when we were taught history, it stopped at 1916, so I knew nothing about the border, I knew nothing about the 6 counties, I knew nothing. So that was my introduction to the Troubles. And in Ireland.
I'm just moving a little bit forward there. Could you tell me about the anti-nuclear movement in Ireland, anti-nuclear campaign in Ireland in the 1970s?
We're still in the 70s. So I came home anyway, and I was working in Kildare as a social worker. That's what I qualified as. And the government, in its wisdom, proposed to build 5 nuclear power station around the coast of Ireland. The first one was to be in Carnsore Point in County Wexford. And the murmuring started about this is a terrible thing to happen. So groups of people started to come together independently of one another, spearheaded, I suppose, by the Friends of the Earth and other interested people who, because the environmentalists didn't even exist at this time, but we had the memory of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki to draw from, which were nuclear power bombs that were dropped in Japan by the Americans and the devastation that caused. And we did it in a very original way, in that we held a festival in Carnsore Point, a free festival, and the first year 5,000 people turned up to the festival. Now, it's not a festival as you would imagine they are today. This was very much an issue-based festival where people came together. We talked, we heard speakers from all over the world talking about what it was like to live with nuclear power. The nuclear power accidents that had happened in, like 3 Mile Island was one that was a huge one in America. We've had a bigger one since then, but at the time...
and you had music as well at the
festival. We had music at the festival, we had theatre, everything. And as I said, the first year, 5,000 people. And of course the government had a field day branding us hippies and all sorts, whatever name they could call us, they called us. The second year we had nearly 50,000 people at it. Because what happened was, at the end of the first festival, everybody went home informed agitated, angry, and started organising in their own community for the next one. And eventually it was one of the proudest moments of my life was when the government said, we're not building nuclear power.
Yes, it was a great success.
Yeah, very great success. And again, at that stage, the second one, there was an amazing, we had exhibition space where different organisations put on exhibitions. And the one that sprung to my mind the most was, at the time, there was the blanket protest was happening in the hedge blocks, and a man brought a cage and sat in the cage wrapped in a blanket to signify what was happening in the hedge blocks at the time. And I was totally blown away by this. Again, I knew nothing about it. But again, that was another important event in my life to tell me about the troubles that we're in.
Yeah. During that period, the anti-nuclear campaign and that, there was a group, Revolutionary Struggle. Weren't they involved in a lot of that type of stuff? And could you tell me anything about that?
There were a group of people, dedicated, committed young people who wanted to bring about a change for the better of the people of Ireland. Very involved with the anti-nuclear movement, very involved subsequently in the H blocks. I became involved with the Dublin Resource Centre at the time, which they were also helped to set up. And the Dublin Resource Centre was a cooperative building.
Is that in Temple Bar?
That was it, or Temple Bar before it was ever called Temple Bar. And in that building I became very involved in cooking, and there was in the basement was the bicycle lockup where you could park your bike, very much ahead of its time. The next floor was a kitchen called the Well-Fed Kitchen that was just books. Upstairs there was a printing workshop, a printer, and then at the top there was a few other little projects happening.
Was there a cafe in there?
That was the Well-Fed Cafe.
I'm pretty sure I was in there and I had sort of
yeah. We were a vegetarian cafe, and we actually won an award as the best vegetarian cafe in Ireland.
All right.
And it was very hard work. And the idea was that because we were unemployed people, I had left social work at this stage, or it left me, I don't know which. It was set up by unemployed, for unemployed, with unemployed, and that was our plan, was to try and get ourselves off the dole. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately we were too radical for the government. They wouldn't help us. Out of that, I became very aware of the proposal by the government to extradite people from Ireland to England, or from Ireland to Belfast. And I got involved in that campaign and ended up the secretary of it. And it was through that I got to know people in Sinn Féin.
And you eventually became a member of Sinn Féin.
I did.
What made you join Sinn Féin?
I was asked, and I felt that maybe I could have a contribution to make, so I became full-time member of the education department along with Jim Monaghan and Rose Dugdale. And I travelled the country, uphill and down dale, and I also, in the education department, we wanted to figure out a way, because there was a lot of prisoners at the time, of how to include the prisoners with the local common. So we set up a little publication called Irish Beag, where we would have different debates, and the prisoners would write for the Irish Beag, and then the common would write, so that there was a conversation happening between prisoners and members of Sinn Féin.
And would this be like prisoners from certain, like if they were a prisoner from Donegal, would it be happening in Donegal Was it different parts of the country?
Oh yeah, I was in every prison in Ireland at the time, because I was the person who went into the prisons to get the articles.
So would you be going into Lankesh?
I was in Lankesh, I was in Macabery, I was in Portlaoise, I was in Limerick. Anywhere there was a Republican prisoner, I would visit.
And was there many women prisoners at that time?
There was. Well, I wouldn't meet them all. I would only meet one, because it was like a visit. I would only meet one at a time. And the biggest problem we had was, how do we get the articles out without the screws reading them first? So we had to have a comm, and that was done through kiss. So I was kissed many times over that period of time. And then we would also have weekend seminars where we would travel around the country to, and there were education seminars for Sinn Féin members to help them be more effective political community activists.
So, because Sinn Féin at that time, well, provisional Sinn Féin, had been quite conservative. This must have played a big part in politicalising Sinn Féin and moving them to the left.
Moved them into politics as such. Whether it was ever a left or a right, I'm not sure. I'm not. Yeah, I've always struggled with those kind of terms because I don't like putting people into boxes. It was interesting. That was a fascinating time because, of course, we were followed everywhere we went. The Gardaí were very interested in my movements. In fact, the first time ever I was arrested was because I was in Donegal, and they came at 8:30 in the morning to the house at home, up the road here, and I was brought over to Naas. I was strip searched, I was held, and at that time it was policy not to say anything. And it was the longest silence I've ever had in my life. But compared to what other people went through, that was nothing.
So when your time in Sinn Féin, you stood for Sinn Féin in the election. I think
That's correct.
Was that in the 1980s?
Yes.
Could you tell me something about that?
Well, at the time there was Section 31, which was one of the most draconian laws in the world to do with censorship. And Sinn Féin was banned from speaking on the media. So I couldn't even go and talk about how to chop an onion at that time because I was a member of Sinn Féin. And to counteract the censorship, Sinn Féin decided to stand for the EU elections. And I put my name forward as a person to stand in Leinster. And it was purely because of censorship, because I knew I didn't have a hope in hell of getting elected. And that's why I stood, because of the censorship.
I seen your poster, wasn't it yellow?
Yellow and black, yeah, a very big departure for Sinn Féin to use those particular colours, because any poster at that time, apart from the hunger strike posters, because that was different. We didn't mention the hunger strike, but anyway, because I'm ahead of that period of time. The black and yellow, that was a radical departure for an election poster at that time.
When you mentioned there the hunger strikes, which went back a bit, could you give your view of the 1980s hunger strikes?
For me, it was one of the most difficult times that I've ever been involved in. The harrowing, heartbreaking time where the hunger strikes were... The prisoners went on hunger strike because they did not want to be criminalised. They were political prisoners. And they had 5 demands. And the 5 demands were no prison uniform, no prison work, 1 visit a week, 1 parcel a week, and 1 letter a week. No, free association. They wanted to be able to associate with one another. Demands. 5 simple demands. And this dates back to the middle 70s. I'm not terribly sure when the blanket protest started first. And that went on until the late 1970s. So it was going on a long number of years.
I think it could have been 76 or 77 they started.
I think, it was a good 3 years anyway. And the blanket protest was where a person was charged in front of a diplock court and sentenced, right? No juries, no nothing that we take for granted to this day.
One judge.
One judge, or 3 judges in the south, one judge in the north, the diplock, thanks. So when you went to jail, you were handed a prison uniform. The prisoners refused to wear the uniform. All they had was a blanket. Hence the blanket protest. And then it became the dirty protest because they refused to slap out, which meant that they had to smear their feces on the wall. And that was getting nowhere. So then the idea came for the hunger strike. Now they had a hunger strike in 1979, I think, where false promises were made and they came off the hunger strike. False promises by the British were made. Nothing happened, so they were forced to go back on the hunger strike. But this time they staggered it, and the first person to go on hunger strike was Bobby Sands. After Bobby Sands, I'll have to... Oh, Harry Hughes, McCrish and Sands, Doherty and Lynch, MacDonough, Horson, McElwee, Devine. And they're the 10 men who died on hunger strike at that time. I'm getting. And
that's so. This is you're involved this time now with you're still involved with the revolutionary struggle. They would have been active in the H Block campaign.
We were all active in the H Block campaign. I was living at home at the time, and we had our own group, H Block group in Newbridge, as again following on the lessons learned from the anti-nuclear movement, where each town, where possible, would have its own group to do black line pickets, where you stand in the middle of the road with a black flag, to put up posters, to write on walls, to write to TDs, to write to papers, to do whatever needed to be done to highlight these terrible situation that was in our country at the time. And of course Maggie Thatcher would have none of it. Again, the bane of my life was Maggie Thatcher, that woman. Oh, anyway, we won't go there.
Could you talk about, you would have been involved in a lot of campaigns to do with women's rights. Could you...
well, now we're jumping, like we're coming along now to the whole area where in the 80s, again, it could have been 85, 86, I can't remember, maybe even later, the government proposed to put into the Constitution the rights of the unborn. Now, I don't know how unborn, what does that mean? And what this meant was that, what it would have meant was that the unborn, the fetus in the womb had more rights than the woman who was carrying her. And that's where I became very involved in campaigning against the amendment. I do believe in a woman's right to choose to this day. And I can't remember was it passed. I think it was passed. but that's where I came from. And I would have knocked on doors here in Newbridge, and I'll never forget one door, and a man came at me with a hatchet calling me a murderer because I was asking them to vote no. So you can imagine. And the Catholic Church had a huge input into this. This was the church really powerful, engaged, and the might of the Catholic Church, the might of that rump that looks upon women as lesser than human beings, was very engaged.
I think Kildare was Kildare.
Kildare was one of the few counties that voted no.
So you obviously did your work.
Well, I wasn't the only one. I mean, my mother was very involved in that as well. So, there was a pair of us in it. And
moving forward again, could you tell me something about your involvement in Bealtaine Art Festival?
Well, yeah. So after that, after that, I kind of got tired. I was exhausted after all my campaigning, so I kind of settled into Newbridge, and became very involved in Newbridge, the community. And the first thing I think I was involved with was the homeless project. And we ran a benefit. And at this time, my mother died. So a year later, we ran the Nancy Moore Memorial Concert in the Moorfield Club to raise funds for the homeless project. And thankfully, we have a homeless shelter.
In the Michael Garry House.
In the Michael Garry House. I mean, that was, the Vincent de Paul were very involved with that as well, so that was, was badly needed in the town.
And were you involved with were you one of the people that campaigned to get the art centre?
Well, what happened there was a group of us came together to try and just lift the spirits of the town, and the best way we could think about it was to run a festival, and it became known as Bealtaine. And Bealtaine was a community arts festival where we involved the schools in being creative. Anybody who wanted to run a gig could run a gig. At the height of the Bealtaine, we had 58 different events happening.
And they used to have a wonderful parade down the town.
Yeah, that was funny how that came about. I decided, Macnas at the time were very big in terms of, Macnas is an arts group over in Galway. I decided I was going to Galway. So I walked in off the street and I said, I want you to come to Newbridge. And they kind of looked at me and said, who's this woman? So anyway, to cut a long story short, they came. And we were the only community outside of Galway that they came to for 3 years on the trot. And for 6 weeks, they worked with the children.
That's right, and they made all these fantastic masks.
Beautiful.
And banners and all.
Yeah, great lift to the town. Yeah. Out of that creativity grew the council that got the notion that, I don't know if you remember, Michael D. Higgins was Minister for Arts and Culture at the time, and he was building art centres to beat the band. So Newbridge was picked because of the creativity in the town at the time. And the art centre was built. It was built in the old site of the vocational school, and I was the person who took the hammer to the first hammer blow to the vocational school was Misha. It was all a photo op thing, to announce that the school was being demolished for the art centre, and it's there now.
Just one last thing. I know you're being an activist. Things like the turf cutting campaign. You've given help towards. Didn't you help the turf cutters?
Well, I spoke with. I spoke with the secretary for a good while. I'm very anxious about what's happening.
Because it's an environmental issue again, isn't it?
Big time environment. I've always been very involved with the environment in one way or another. And it's an interesting one because on the one hand you want to preserve the heritage of the country. But on the other hand, you have to do it in a way that people can live and heat their homes. Now, what really frustrated me about this is that the biggest organisation in the country that's destroying the bags is Bealtaine, and Bealtaine has not been touched. To me, that's where we need to start, not with people who need the turf to heat their and cook and feed their children. Do you know? Yeah, I know any time anybody comes knocking on my door, I'll always have Culture Factory was another organisation that I was involved with, and that was my latest, and unfortunately it hasn't worked out. But a group of young people knocked on my door one day to say how fed up they were, that there was nothing in the town for them. When I was growing up in this town, which was about 5,000 population, there was 5 halls to dance in. We are now 30,000, and there isn't one except for the bloody pubs, the late night thing. There's nowhere for young people to go.
And I think the Culture Factory, it did put pressure on the authority, like the cinema had to open, and it forced them to do something, even if it's very small.
Yeah, and the old cinema was what we were after, but it just became unrealistic in terms of what it was going to cost us before we could even get a grant. And it kind of just stopped. But I'm hoping that seed has been sown, and that somebody else will come up with an idea that for our beautiful young people, they are our future. Is that it?
That's it, Terry.
Well, I want to sing a song now before I'm finished.
Right, that's fine. That's it here.
Excuse me now. My brother suggested I sing this song. From the health centre porch, she looks to the north, where Nicaragua's enemies hide. Polio crippled and maimed before things were changed. Slowly they're turning the tide. In the twilight she stands with a rifle in hand and a memory of what used to be. Now she is part of the unfinished revolution. Feudal landlords they've known, seen overthrown. Afghanistan comes into view. Learning to read and to write is part of the fight. For her, it's something that's new. Down all of the years, ashamed of her tears, hidden behind a black veil. Now she is part of the unfinished revolution. Soldiers kicked down the door, called her a whore, while he lingered in Castlereagh. Internment tore them apart, brought her to the heart of resistance in Belfast today. Though the struggle is long, it's hard to be strong. She's determined deep down inside to be a part of the unfinished revolution. She holds the key to the unfinished revolution. Sinead Cara. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you.